Metroid on the NES is absolute garbage. Okay, maybe that's a bit harsh. But regardless, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that it's certainly become a bit antiquated over the years. What was once an impressive, ambitious adventure has since become a bit of a dated mess. It's got a number of issues, so much so that revisiting it is often rather frustrating. Now, for most series, this really wouldn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. So what if an entry or two are dated? You don't really need to play them all, right? You can just skip those ones and get straight to the good ones. But that's just the thing, Metroid isn't like most series. Unlike most series where an ongoing narrative is a pipe dream, Metroid thrives off its continued narrative. Every single entry in the series is important and all lead into the next game, so skipping one tends to leave you with a bit of lost context. So, it'd be rather unfortunate if a critical piece of the series lore was locked behind some dated NES game. It seems like that was Nintendo's idea at the very least, as in 2004 the Metroid series would see its next major entry in the form of a full-on remake of the original Metroid in Metroid Zero Mission for the Game Boy Advance. It was a really smart move on their part to do this. On one hand, Metroid was most in need of a remake, and this makes it so that new fans of the series could discover more of Samus Aran's story without delving into an antiquated NES game. Alongside this, making a remake in Fusion's engine was an easy way to reuse an existing engine without breaking the bank. But Zero Mission wasn't just any old remake, oh no. Instead, it would prove to be the best kind of remake, one that takes the foundation of the original and improves it in almost every conceivable way, making for an experience that completely replaces the original. In every respect, Zero Mission would prove to be a perfect remake. Well, kinda. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my game over analysis of Metroid Zero Mission. It's go time! The story here is much the same as the NES game. Space pirates attack a Federation-owned ship holding samples of Metroids, a ridiculously dangerous creature capable of sucking the life out of any creature it comes into contact with. The space pirates intend to replicate the Metroids for their own personal gain, and obviously since the Federation can't have that, they send out a bounty hunter by the name of Samus Aran to go wipe out the space pirate base. So Samus lands on planet Zebes, the location of the space pirate base, to hopefully put an end to the space pirates' nefarious plot. Now, while the basic framework of the plot remains unchanged, Zero Mission right out the gate is trying to outdo the original. This time, there's an actual intro cutscene explaining the plot. You actually know what's going on right at the start of the game without the need to check a manual or anything. Alongside this, Zero Mission features these gorgeous cutscenes to set the scene and add a bit of scale to the adventure as well. While there certainly aren't as many of them as I'd like, each of them is an absolute treat and helps to flesh out what was originally a very basic setup to the game. Right after you land on Zebes, another immediate improvement will show itself. Samus not only controls miles ahead of the NES original, but they've somehow managed to improve the controls even over Metroid Fusion. Inputs feel more snappy this time, with jumping, combat, and general movement being an absolute dream this time around. In Metroid 1, there were often these odd places where you needed to land on a very small platform, and it always felt super awkward with Samus's wonky controls. But here it's an absolute breeze. Jumps especially have this perfect arc to them, and platforming with a now even better ledge grab mechanic feels super satisfying. Samus even has these new wonderfully flowing animations. I'm not joking, just the way Samus animates while moving and jumping makes the game feel more satisfying. Combat as well is an absolute blast, with Samus's blaster packing a very noticeable punch. The only issue is that the enemies aren't really scaled to match your newfound controls. They kept the enemy patterns as close to the original as possible, meaning that the vast majority of enemies really don't do much beyond walk back and forth on a platform. It's rather unfortunate that they didn't try to fix this element from the original, as the dynamic enemy designs is what made Fusion's combat such a blast, but in the end it isn't that big of a deal. There are still a couple enemies with more dynamic movements, and even when it's not the case, it's still ridiculously satisfying to take the enemies down, so there's that. And you know, satisfying may just be the perfect word to describe Zero Mission. No matter where you are in the game, Zero Mission just has this absurdly satisfying feel to it. From the moment you land on Zebes to the very end of the game, Zero Mission just has this wonderful flow to it. Like it constantly feels like you're moving forward, never stopping or slowing down. And it really fits considering how Metroid NES was always supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to feel like this rip-roaring adventure where Samus is absolutely tearing her way through the space pirate base. The game never really goes for a more ominous or melancholic atmosphere like the other games go for, and to be fair, it doesn't really need to. Instead, Zero Mission genuinely feels like a high-stakes adventure. progression is lightning fast, and you're never too far off of discovering some new upgrade or secret. I'm serious, within the first 20 minutes, you'd have found the morph ball, the long beam, missiles, and even potentially more. Zero Mission never stops with its breakneck pace. Also helping things is the game's system of telling you where to go. Every once in a while you'll run into these Chozo statues, which after jumping onto them will not only fully replenish your health and missiles, but will also give you a good idea of where to go next. It's really useful to new players, or if you might not remember where you need to go, and yet it's really never all that in the way. Not only do you not really need to pay attention to these things, but even if you do, they only really give you a general idea of where you need to go without revealing too much. It's a good way of pointing players in the right direction without ruining the fun of discovery and exploration. Because of this, there's never any points where it feels like you won't know where to go. It essentially fixes Metroid NES's confusing progression system while also keeping the thrill of discovery. It really can't be understated just how much of a thrill ride this game feels like. It feels like a roller coaster if I'm being honest. You're just blasting through these areas, discovering secrets and finding upgrades. Puzzle design this time around is on point as well. There's never any bombing random walls and hoping for the best like the original. Instead, everything is shown to you through subtle environmental cues, things like a cracked block or a very obvious dent in the wall. One thing that really impressed me when I first played it was when I got to this area. I was stuck for a bit wondering exactly what I missed. I just couldn't figure it out. Then suddenly I looked at this lava pool and noticed that there were enemies just kind of walking around in it like there wasn't even anything there. I then discovered that it actually wasn't there, and that the enemies were there to clue me in on that. Zero Mission is full of this kind of brilliant design. It never really feels too obvious, but it never gets to the point of being cryptic either. It just requires a watchful eye and a bit of thinking, making general exploration feel super rewarding. The only case where it feels kinda iffy is here. You see, there's actually no way to progress forward, despite the fact that you literally just entered this area. You would assume that there's some way to progress forward in this area, but no, you're actually supposed to head back to the previous area and discover that a hole's been dug right in the area you were trying to get into. It's not too horrible in the end, but it definitely feels like it's not really led into that well. Thankfully, cases like this are the exception, not the rule, as Zero Mission almost always keeps up this wonderful puzzle quality throughout. It also helps that this time around you actually have a map, meaning that unlike the original, you don't constantly feel like you're lost. It's such a simple addition, but a useful one nonetheless. Also, something really cool is that just like Super Metroid, many of the power-ups like missile expansions and energy tanks can be gotten well before you're supposed to. With some well-timed wall jumps or some bomb jumping, you can get a surprising number of power-ups early. It really can't be understated just how electrifying it feels to do this. Like, it genuinely feels like you're somehow outsmarting the developers, despite the fact that it's clearly an intentional design choice. I know that this was technically the case in Metroid NES as well, but Zero Mission's improved controls make this process not only more feasible to actually do, but much more satisfying to boot. The only problem is that since the game is already rather easy compared to previous entries, getting these upgrades early on makes the game feel way easier. In the end though, it really doesn't take away from just how wonderful it feels to actually pull it off, and if anything, making the game easier just makes the process feel all the more rewarding. Getting the upgrades feels like it actually means something, which is great. You know, I think it's kind of funny how I've went this long without discussing the most obvious improvement. One look is all you'll need to see that this game is a massive visual leap over Metroid NES. Everything from the models to the environmental design has been completely overhauled and given a new coat of paint. The game actually has backgrounds now. Areas actually look visually distinct. Samus looks like, well, Samus. That's all pretty obvious. I mean, you can probably see that all yourself. What's less obvious is how much this helps the progression of the game. In NES, the game's different rooms often lacked a visual identity, every area looking very similar to the last, and that's when the rooms weren't outright reused. This made progression in the original a bit confusing. It was hard to tell where you have and haven't explored. This time, however, they've made sure to make every area look distinct. You can tell at a glance where you are through very obvious changes in backgrounds and environmental design. With every area feeling distinct, it becomes so much easier to progress, as it never feels like you're going into the same rooms. With that being said, while the areas look distinct, it still carries over the basic level design of the original. And yes, sure, it means we get some of the iffier parts of the design. These vertical shafts certainly don't feel all that exciting to explore, and some rooms still kind of feel empty. But the numerous changes and additions to the game world really let the level design shine in other areas. I also should note while I'm kind of on the topic, the remade soundtrack is wonderful. I actually like all the arrangements this time. The ones that I loved before, like Kraid's Lair, are absolutely fantastic, And they even managed to take tracks I wasn't a fan of and make them better. Looking at you, Ridley Slayer. It's genuinely a solid effort all around. But you know, speaking of Ridley, that's another thing Metroid Zero Mission improves over the original. In Metroid 1, there basically weren't any real bosses. Sure, you had fights with Ridley and Kraid, but it never really felt like much more than a slightly more tanky enemy. Zero Mission, however, is much more focused on upping the spectacle, so not only have they beefed up the old fights, but they've added in a couple new ones as well. They're nothing too complex, but it's nice that the game at least tried. Like, having next to no fights in the original made it feel a little aimless in the end, so I appreciate actually having something to look forward to. And adding to Zero Mission's spontaneous nature, these fights almost always feel like they come out of nowhere. Like you just enter a room and bam, the enemy flies out of the walls and attacks you. My favorite example is in Ridley's case, where you enter the clearly marked room expecting a fight and he just doesn't show up? He waits until after you've gotten the glitched upgrade before suddenly attacking. It sucks that his fight is way too short and easy, and you can pretty much destroy him in like 30 seconds, but it's an improvement over the NES fight at least. But hey, isn't it weird that I haven't mentioned a pretty obvious boss, one that I had quite a bit to say about in the original video? We'll get there in a bit, I promise. After taking down Ridley and Kraid, you finally get access to Criteria, the location of the final boss, Mother Brain. As you arrive in Criteria, however, you're ransacked by a bunch of Metroids, and this might just be the most terrifying they've ever been. The Metroids are freaking ruthless, coming from the background and immediately chasing you down. Getting them off isn't easy either, as even if you manage to get free of them with a well-placed bomb, they immediately begin chasing you down again. Seriously, these things are pretty much the one enemy in the game that actually feels like a serious threat. So you spend several minutes cautiously trying to get rid of these Metroids, only to find the center of the Space Pirates operation, and the location of Mother Brain. Now in the original game, I wasn't the biggest fan of this fight. It was just irritating. Samus's awkward controls combined with the really bizarre projectiles flying around the screen and some rather irritating positioning required to hit the enemy made for a really annoying fight. So clearly because it was so annoying, Zero Mission had to improve things, right? No, it's even worse. Now the place is much more claustrophobic, and the projectiles not only seem to move faster, but there's just less room to maneuver around them. And actually hitting Mother Brain is a nightmare. You have these very small platforms to stand on while trying to shoot her with missiles, which would be fine if you weren't constantly being knocked into the lava. Samus controls like garbage in the lava, meaning that getting out is a pain. And even if you do get out, good luck staying out with all these floating rings and Mother Brain's wave attack, which wonderfully is like the only attack that can hit you while you're hanging off the side of a platform. Somehow, they've managed to make the fight even worse here, combining the irritating projectiles with even less room to maneuver and even more annoyances to deal with. They really dropped the ball with this one, honestly. At least the escape sequence is even cooler this time. The new improved production values combined with a more complex layout and snappy controls take what was already a cool section and makes it even cooler. And so you finally manage to destroy Mother Brain and manage to escape the destruction of the base. The day is saved once again by Samus Aran. Or so you'd think. While escaping the planet, Samus is shot down and crash lands back on Zebes. Even worse is that she's already removed her power suit while on the ship, leaving her in her incredibly weak Zero suit with nothing but her plasma pistol to defend herself. The pistol, however, can't kill anything. It can only freeze an enemy in place. With no easy way to fight enemies, Samus is forced to sneak around, and the game becomes a bit of a stealth game for a while. You have to try your absolute best not to get caught unless you're really confident in your ability to outrun the Space Pirates, as they can decimate Samus in a mere couple hits. This is where the game can become one of two things depending on how you approach it. On one end, it can become a thrilling and terrifying stealth set piece, where you need to carefully thread your way through this place without getting caught. It can be genuinely tense at times, as getting caught will not only cause the pirate that sees you to attack you, but any pirates in the vicinity as well. It's genuinely exciting. But what's just as exciting is option 2, where you just book it all the way through, stealth be damned. In this case, the game becomes more of this thrilling test of your ability to make decisions on the fly, as even a moment's hesitation could lead to your death. I always go for the latter, as I really like being chased in games for some reason. The best part though is that either choice is exciting for its own reasons, and you get to choose which style you want to go with. I'm really glad they added this section to the game. It varies up the gameplay just enough where it feels like an exciting change of pace without feeling too foreign to the general design of Metroid. Eventually, you'll come across this odd shrine created by the Chozo, which after a short fight not only gives Samus her suit back, but manages to activate several previously unavailable abilities as well. You see, as you progress through the base, you'll find these weird upgrades that for some reason can't be recognized by the suit. This builds and builds until this moment, when Samus finally gets all these abilities all at once, making her a powerhouse. From this point on, you essentially run around and lay waste to all those who oppose you, all with this triumphant theme playing in the background. Just moments ago, these enemies were chasing you down, threatening to take you down with just a couple hits. And now those very same enemies that had you run and hide from them are running and hiding from you. It's just so ridiculously satisfying. Like in one moment all of your struggles vanish and you're allowed to just go to town. After completely destroying this part of the ship, Samus manages to escape on one of the space pirates' own vessels, thus ending Metroid Zero Mission. It's a ridiculously satisfying ending, and is just the continuation of Metroid Zero Mission's constant attempt to keep the adventure feeling like this rip-roaring good time. As a remake of Metroid NES, which was attempting to give off the same feeling with its own, albeit dated design, Metroid Zero Mission manages to be an almost perfect remake of the original. It gets across all the ideas Metroid NES was going for, but managed to greatly exceed it in almost every regard. But you might have noticed that I said almost. For as much as Metroid Zero Mission manages to succeed in taking the dated original and expand on it, there's still all these small little issues. Things that on their own don't mean much, but together mean a lot. Its primitive enemy design and occasionally primitive level design feel all the more noticeable because of all the upgrades to the core game design. They decided to stick far too closely to the original's design in some cases, and I think that it hurts the game a bit. While they did upgrade the complexity of bosses, it's really not by as much as it needs to be. After Fusion, which has some of the coolest fights in the entire series, these bosses almost feel like jokes by comparison, barely lasting more than a minute and being taken out with relatively few hits. And speaking of bosses, they've somehow managed to take everything bad about the Mother Brain fight and worsen it. And if I'm being honest, while I love this game's more adventurous feel, that doesn't stop me from feeling a little let down by this game's lack of atmosphere or narrative importance. The game focuses so much on being this thrilling adventure that it never really stops to smell the roses, so to speak. It doesn't have time for atmosphere in the same regards. It doesn't have time for environmental storytelling either, and heck, it doesn't even have time for storytelling in general. While it certainly has more going on than the original, this game feels surprisingly empty on storytelling and world building. I mean, its intro cutscene lasts 30 seconds and then you're just tossed into the game. Even Super Metroid had more going on in that regard, with not only a solid cutscene at the beginning and end, but a massive focus on environmental storytelling to help fill in the blanks between. Besides establishing the space pirates and the little bits of lore we get about Samus's relation to the Chozo, we get almost nothing here. No narrative, no environmental storytelling, nothing. And it just so happens that these are my favorite things about the Metroid series. You've heard me discuss it over and over again in each video, and that's for a reason. Sure, I love the core game design, but I love all these things just as much. As one of the few weirdos that likes Metroid Fusion for its narrative and atmosphere, Zero Mission feels rather hollow by comparison. It feels like it's missing some of the core elements that make me love Metroid so much. And you know, that would be a bigger problem if Metroid Zero Mission wasn't an absolute joy to play. Sure, it's missing some of the elements that make me adore Metroid games in the first place, but if I'm being honest with myself, it's hard to deny how brilliant the game design is. It almost makes up for it if I'm being honest. From beginning to end, Metroid Zero Mission is this fantastic joyride, one that flows so seamlessly that it's hard not to want to keep playing. Its control, its simple but satisfying level design, its rewarding upgrade system, and the sheer energy it gives off is impossible not to enjoy. Sure, it's not my favorite over Fusion or Prime, but somehow through sheer gameplay quality alone, it makes it pretty dang close. And really, it doesn't matter all that much in the end. Metroid Zero Mission wasn't trying to be the next big Metroid experience, one that would take the series in a bold new direction. No, it was trying to take a highly dated game and update it for the modern era. A game that's original focus was trying to be exactly what Zero Mission is, an exciting high-stakes adventure focused on exploration and action. And in that regard, while it certainly messes up in a couple areas, Metroid Zero Mission still manages to be an almost perfect remake of Metroid on the NES. And hey, I mean, this is only supposed to be a stopgap release anyways, right? I mean, the next 2D Metroid game was bound to not be too far off. Surely soon we'd see the next major entry in the 2D Metroid series, right? Well, that couldn't be further from the case, because it would be over a decade before the Metroid series would finally see its next 2D entry. But this game wasn't just a case of Nintendo finally returning to a formula they had left behind. Instead, the next 2D game in the lineup would end up being the revival of the series after years and years of turbulence and neglect. And we'll talk about that game, Metroid Samus Returns, next time. Until then, I guess that's game over. Analysis.